Dust swirled around the wooden auction block as cruel laughter echoed through the Colorado Valley. They were bidding on a woman's life like cattle. When a harsh voice mocked her size, the laughter abruptly died. A heavy hammer cocked. A towering shadow stepped forward, silencing the frontier town entirely. The unforgiving late afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Oakhaven, a booming silver town nestled deep in the jagged embrace of the San Juan Mountains. It was the autumn of 1874, a time when the law was often dictated by the man with the deepest pockets and the fewest morals. In Oakhaven, that man was Wyatt Crenshaw. Standing on a makeshift platform composed of empty whiskey barrels and rough-hewn pine planks, Clara Higgins kept her chin high, though her hands trembled violently where they were clasped in front of her faded calico dress. She was 22 years old, with striking auburn hair and soft, kind features. But in the harsh, starved reality of the frontier, Clara was different. She possessed a full, curvy figure, a softness that spoke of her time working in her late father's bakery back in Missouri, before the promise of silver drew them to this unforgiving wilderness. Josiah Higgins had been a good man, but a terrible miner. When the damp, freezing conditions of the deep shafts claimed his life to lung fever 3 months prior, he left Clara with nothing but a mountain of inflated promissory notes. Wyatt Crenshaw, the predatory owner of the Gilded Spur Saloon, had quietly bought up every single debt. When Clara couldn't pay, Wyatt invoked an archaic, brutal territorial loophole, indentured servitude, to settle a deceased kin's ledger. "Step right up, gentlemen," Wyatt's voice carried over the murmuring crowd, dripping with theatrical malice. He adjusted his silk brocade vest, a stark contrast to the dirt-caked miners surrounding the platform. "The ledger states Miss Higgins owes the Oakhaven Bank and Trust, which I happen to represent the sum of $400. Since she lacks the coin, she is offering her services. Cook, cleaner, or a dutiful frontier wife to the highest bidder." Clara's cheeks burned with a mix of profound humiliation and searing anger. She looked out at the faces of the townsfolk. Some women, like the local seamstress Mrs. Gable, looked away in silent pity. But the men, hardened by rock and cheap liquor, leered with unapologetic cruelty. $400? Shouted Jebediah Rust, a scrawny prospector missing half his teeth. For that? She'd eat a man out of his winter stores before the first snow hits. A chorus of cruel laughter erupted. Clara bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. She would not cry. She had promised her father she would be strong. Now, Jebediah," Wyatt sneered, pacing around Clara like a wolf circling a wounded fawn. "She looks like she can pull a plow well enough. A bit much to look at, sure. Look at those hips. You'd need a reinforced wagon just to haul her up the mountain." "She's too heavy," hollered Billy Coogan, a drunkard leaning against the mercantile post. "A horse's spine would snap trying to carry her." "Offer her for $10, Wyatt, and I might use her to churn butter." The crowd roared again, the insults flying like physical stones. Cow, sow, too soft, too heavy. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the earth would crack open and swallow her whole. The humiliation was absolute. She was entirely alone in a town that had stripped away her humanity for the sake of an unpaid piece of paper. But then the laughter began to taper off. It didn't stop all at once, but rather died in a rolling wave, starting from the back of the crowd and moving toward the platform. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air seemed to grow 10 degrees colder. Clara opened her eyes. The townsfolk were hastily parting, shuffling backward and stepping on each other's boots to clear a wide path down the center of the muddy street. The jingle of heavy iron spurs cut through the sudden, eerie silence. Walking toward the platform was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite peaks that loomed above the town. He stood an imposing 6'4", his shoulders broad beneath a coat of beautifully tanned elk hide and thick bear fur. His face was weathered, deeply tanned by altitude and wind, framed by dark, untamed hair and a rugged beard. A jagged, faded scar ran down the left side of his jaw, hinting at a violent past. Strapped to his back was a massive Sharps buffalo rifle, and resting effortlessly on his right hip was a custom, long-barreled Colt Patterson revolver. It was Gideon Cole. Whispers broke out among the terrified townsfolk. Gideon was a legend in Oakhaven, a solitary mountain man who lived high in the treacherous peaks of Whispering Pines. He only came down to the settlement twice a year to trade prime furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition. Men told stories about him that he had fought off a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife, that he was an exiled outlaw from Texas, that he possessed no fear and no mercy. Gideon did not look at the crowd. His piercing, storm-gray eyes were locked dead on the platform. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, the kind of quiet confidence that only came from a man who knew he was the most dangerous living thing in the valley. Wyatt Crenshaw's arrogant smirk faltered. He took a subtle step back, his hand instinctively twitching toward the derringer hidden in his coat pocket. "Cole," Wyatt said, attempting to project authority. "We're conducting legal business here. Debt collection. Move along." Gideon stopped at the base of the platform. He slowly raised his gaze to Clara. For a fleeting second, Clara expected to see the same disgust and mockery in his eyes that she had seen in everyone else's. Instead, she saw a profound, unwavering calm. He looked at her, not as property or a joke, but as a woman. "I'd take her to scrub the saloon floors," Wyatt continued, trying to regain the crowd's favor, his voice dripping with nervous venom. But like the boys said, look at her. She's too heavy for any real use. The silence that followed was deafening. Gideon's jaw tightened, in a blur of motion so fast it defied his massive size. Gideon's right hand dropped to his hip. The unmistakable clack-clack of a heavy revolver hammer being thumbed back echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet street. Gideon leveled the massive Colt Patterson directly at the center of Wyatt Crenshaw's chest. "She's perfect," Gideon said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, low and quiet, yet it carried an undeniable weight that commanded absolute obedience. Nobody breathed. The drunkards who had been howling insults mere seconds ago were now frozen, their eyes wide with terror. Sheriff Tobias Finch, who had been conveniently observing the illegal auction from the safety of the barbershop porch, took one look at the drawn Colt and firmly decided to stay exactly where he was. Wyatt Crenshaw swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The barrel of the Patterson looked as wide as a mine shaft. "Now, hold on, Gideon. I'm well within my rights. Josiah Higgins owed me $400, the law says." "The law in this town is bought with cheap whiskey and lies," Gideon interrupted softly. Without taking his eyes off Wyatt, he reached into his heavy leather coat with his left hand. He pulled out a thick, stained leather pouch and tossed it underhand. It hit the wooden planks at Wyatt's feet with a heavy, metallic thud. The pouch tipped over, spilling a small fortune in raw, glittering gold nuggets and refined dust onto the rough wood. It was easily worth double the claimed debt. "Debt's paid," Gideon stated, his gun still steady. "Tear up the notes, Crenshaw." Wyatt stared at the gold, his innate greed warring fiercely with his instinct for self-preservation. Trembling, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the folded stack of promissory notes bearing Josiah Higgins's signature, and let them flutter to the dusty planks. "She's yours," Wyatt spat bitterly, though he kept his hands raised where Gideon could see them. "But you just bought yourself a useless liability, mountain man. You think a soft, heavy thing like her is going to survive a week up at Whispering Pines?" Gideon finally holstered his weapon. The smooth slide of steel against leather was the only sound. He stepped up onto the platform and walked over to Clara. Up close, he was even more massive. Clara shrank back instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just traded a life of indentured servitude in a saloon for ownership by a wild, terrifying mountain man. What would he do to her? Gideon stopped 2 feet away. He reached up and slowly removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing kind, tired eyes that deeply contrasted his rugged exterior. He offered her a slight, respectful bow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "if you'll collect your things, we should make the timberline before nightfall." He didn't grab her. He didn't drag her off the stage. He simply offered his thick, calloused hand. Clara looked at his hand, then up at his face. The mockery of the town still stung her ears, but in this man's shadow, she felt a strange, inexplicable sanctuary. Gathering her remaining courage, she placed her small hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely steady. Gideon led her off the platform. The crowd parted instantly, refusing to meet the mountain man's glare. They walked to the edge of town, where Gideon had hitched his horse, a magnificent, towering black draft horse named Samson, built to carry immense weight across treacherous terrain. Clara had nothing to collect. The bank had already seized her father's rented room and their meager belongings. She stood by the massive horse, acutely aware of her figure, the insults of the townsfolk echoing in her mind. Too heavy for a horse to carry. She looked at the saddle, her cheeks flushing with fresh embarrassment. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I don't think I can ride. I'm afraid I might hurt your horse. They were right. I am heavy." Gideon paused as he adjusted the saddle girth. He turned to look at her, really look at her. His gaze took in her curves, the fullness of her hips, the softness of her face. There was no judgment, no sneering cruelty. "Miss Higgins," Gideon said quietly, "Samson here pulls loaded timber carts out of the mud for fun. He won't even notice you." He stepped closer, his storm gray eyes softening. "And those fools back there? They're starved in mind and spirit. They look at you and see a burden because they are weak men. Up on the mountain, strength and substance are what keep you alive. Like I said, you're perfect." A single tear broke free and rolled down Clara's cheek. It was the first bit of kindness she had been shown since her father died. Gideon easily hoisted himself into the saddle, then reached down. With astonishing strength, he gripped Clara's arm and waist, lifting her effortlessly until she was seated sideways behind him. She wrapped her arms tentatively around his thick, fur-clad waist, feeling the solid, immovable muscle beneath. With a click of his tongue, Gideon spurred Samson forward. They rode out of Oakhaven without looking back, leaving the stunned and humiliated Wyatt Crenshaw staring at the gold on the platform. The journey up into the San Juans was breathtaking. As they climbed higher, the dusty, oppressive heat of the valley gave way to the crisp, pine-scented air of the high country. The trail wound through dense forests of blue spruce and trembling aspen, their leaves turning brilliant shades of gold in the autumn chill. For the first few hours, they rode in silence. Clara was terrified of the unknown, yet entirely mesmerized by the sheer beauty of the wilderness. She pressed her cheek against the rough leather of Gideon's coat as the temperature began to drop. "Why did you do it?" Clara finally asked, the question burning in her chest. The wind whipped her auburn hair around her face. $400. A man doesn't pay that kind of gold just for a stranger. "Did you really buy me?" Gideon chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated against Clara's chest. "I didn't buy you, Clara. Nobody can buy a person. I paid a debt to get you out of a trap." He pulled gently on the reins, letting Samson rest as they reached a scenic overlook. The entire valley stretched out below them, Oakhaven looking like a tiny, insignificant collection of toy blocks. "And I didn't do it for a stranger," Gideon continued, his voice taking on a somber tone. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver object attached to a broken chain. He handed it back over his shoulder to her. Clara gasped. She took the object with trembling fingers. It was a pocket watch, intricately engraved with a soaring eagle. "My father's watch," she breathed. "He lost this in a poker game to Wyatt months ago. He was so ashamed." "Your father, Josiah, didn't lose this in a game," Gideon corrected gently. "I recognized it when I saw it hanging from Crenshaw's vest today. 5 years ago, before you came to Oakhaven, your father was hauling supplies through the northern pass. I was mauled by a mountain lion, bleeding out in the snow. Most men would have left me to die, but Josiah loaded me into his wagon, patched me up, and gave me this watch to keep track of the time while I healed in a cave. He saved my life." Clara stared at the back of Gideon's head, the pieces falling into place. "When I heard his daughter was being auctioned off by a snake like Crenshaw over a forged debt," Gideon said, his voice hardening into steel, "I made my way down the mountain. The gold was the peaceful way out. If Crenshaw hadn't taken it, well, I would have taken you anyway." Clara clutched her father's watch to her chest, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She wasn't a captive. She was under the protection of a man repaying a life debt. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow-capped ridges, a small, beautifully constructed log cabin came into view. Smoke lazily drifted from the stone chimney. It looked warm, sturdy, and safe. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," Gideon said, helping her down from the great black horse. But as Clara stepped onto the porch of her new sanctuary, she couldn't shake the chilling realization that men like Wyatt Crenshaw did not suffer public humiliation lightly. The mountain was isolated, but the reach of greedy men was long, and the gold Gideon had dropped in the town square had painted a massive target on both their backs. For the first month, the cabin at Whispering Pines felt less like a sanctuary and more like a dream Clara might wake from at any moment. She kept waiting for the harshness of the frontier to reassert itself, for Gideon to demand the servitude Wyatt Crenshaw had promised. But the mountain man demanded nothing. Instead, a quiet, profound rhythm developed between them. The cabin was well stocked, but survival at 10,000 feet required relentless effort. Here, Clara quickly discovered that the softness the townsfolk had mocked was her greatest asset. Her sturdy build gave her the endurance to haul heavy buckets of pristine spring water from the freezing creek, and the natural insulation of her body kept her warm when the brutal alpine winds rattled the log walls. She took over the hearth, using the last of Gideon's flour and wild yeast to bake hearty, crusty loaves of bread that filled the cabin with the scent of home, a smell Gideon hadn't experienced in a decade. One evening, as the first true snow of November began to dust the pine branches outside, Clara sat by the crackling fire, mending a tear in Gideon's heavy wool shirt. Gideon sat across from her, carefully oiling the massive mechanism of his Sharps buffalo rifle. "You never stop working," Gideon observed, his deep voice breaking the comfortable silence. Clara looked up, a self-conscious flush creeping up her neck. "I want to earn my keep, Mr. Cole. I know I eat my share of the stores." The cruel echoes of the Oakhaven men still lingered in her mind like ghosts. Gideon paused, laying the rifle across his knees. His storm-gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Clara, put the needle down." She obeyed, resting her hands in her lap. "I told you down in that dusty street, and I will tell you every day until you believe it," Gideon said softly, leaning forward. "Those men in town are hollow. They want a woman they can break, someone fragile. Out here, fragility is a death sentence. I watch you carry firewood that would cripple half those drunken miners. I see the strength in your hips, the power in your back. You are beautiful, Clara. You are built for the mountain. Built for a real life." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She had never been looked at with such raw, undisguised admiration. Slowly, Gideon reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw with his calloused thumb, wiping away a single tear that had escaped. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. In that quiet cabin, beneath the howling wind, Clara realized she was falling deeply in love with the man who had bought her life only to set her free. But down in the valley, a different fire was burning. Wyatt Crenshaw had not forgotten the absolute humiliation he suffered in front of the entire town. His pride was a venomous thing, and the sight of Gideon's gold only fueled his greed. Crenshaw was convinced that Gideon had struck a massive, secret vein of gold high in the San Juans. He wanted the gold, and he wanted the girl back, not for her labor, but to make a brutal public example of them both. Knowing his local thugs were terrified of the mountain man, Crenshaw sent a telegram eastward, spending a small fortune to hire a specialist. He reached out to a notorious, real-life Texas gunslinger and outlaw whose reputation for ruthlessness was spreading across the territories, John King Fisher. Fisher happened to be laying low in Denver, avoiding a federal warrant. For a 50% cut of the supposed gold mine and $1,000 up front, the famously flamboyant killer agreed to the job. Decked out in his signature tiger skin chaps and a pair of ivory-handled revolvers, Fisher arrived in Oakhaven with 3 hardened bushwhackers. "The mountain man is big, fast, and knows the terrain," Crenshaw warned Fisher as they stood at the bar of the Gilded Spur, tracing a crude map of the peaks. "And he's got a woman up there with him." Fisher chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He adjusted his wide-brimmed sombrero. "A man with a woman has a tether, Crenshaw. He's got something to lose. We ride up tomorrow before the heavy drifts lock the pass. We take the gold, we burn the cabin, and we drag the girl back down by her hair." The blizzard hit 2 days earlier than Gideon expected. It came in the dead of night, a howling white wall that dropped the temperature to deadly depths. At dawn, Clara was tending the hearth when the massive black draft horse, Samson, began to kick violently against the walls of his attached stable. A moment later, a sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the whistling wind. Gideon, instantly awake, rolled out of his cot. He grabbed his Colt Patterson, motioning for Clara to stay low. "Rifle fire," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's out there." He kicked open the heavy oak door, instantly swallowed by the blinding, swirling snow. Clara crawled to the window, her heart pounding against her ribs, peering through a crack in the frost-covered glass. Through the blizzard, she saw shadows moving among the tree line. Then, the silence was shattered by a deafening volley of gunfire. Wood splintered around the doorframe. Gideon returned fire, his Colt roaring as he dropped one of the approaching bushwhackers in the snow. But there were too many, and the whiteout conditions obscured their exact positions. From the cover of a massive spruce, John King Fisher took careful aim with a Winchester repeating rifle. The rifle cracked. Clara screamed as Gideon stumbled backward, his massive frame twisting. A bullet had torn through his upper thigh, dropping him into the deep snow just outside the threshold of the cabin. "Gideon!" Clara shrieked. "Stay inside," Gideon roared, clutching his leg as blood stained the pristine snow crimson. He tried to push himself up, but his leg collapsed under his immense weight. From the tree line, Wyatt Crenshaw emerged, flanked by Fisher and the remaining thugs. Crenshaw laughed, the sound carrying over the wind. "Well, well." The great mountain man brought to his knees. "And where's your prize cow, Cole?" "Bring her out." Clara looked at the Sharps rifle leaning by the fireplace. She looked at Gideon, bleeding out in the freezing snow. If she stayed inside, they would kill him and then come for her. Too soft, too heavy, a useless liability. The town's jeers rang in her ears one final time, but they no longer held any power over her. Gideon had shown her the truth. She was strong. Without hesitating, Clara threw open the cabin door and plunged into the freezing tempest. Crenshaw barked a laugh. "Look at this. The fat baker's daughter is going to save him. You can't even lift him, you stupid heifer." Clara ignored him. She grabbed Gideon by the thick leather lapels of his coat. He weighed over 250 pounds, dead weight in deep snow. But Clara planted her sturdy, powerful legs. She engaged her hips and her broad back, the very body the town had mocked, and pulled with a ferocious, primal scream. Gideon gasped in shock as Clara hoisted him backward, her boots finding purchase on the ice. She didn't falter. She didn't break. With sheer, unrelenting physical power, she dragged the massive mountain man across the threshold and slammed the heavy oak door shut with her foot, dropping the thick iron bar into place just as a bullet buried itself in the wood. "Clara," Gideon breathed, clutching his bleeding leg, looking up at her in absolute awe. She didn't have time to answer. Clara grabbed the massive Sharps buffalo rifle, a gun most men struggled to fire without a resting block. She knocked out the chinking between two logs near the door, creating a firing hole. Outside, Fisher and Crenshaw were charging the cabin, thinking the wounded man and the terrified woman were easy prey. Clara leveled the heavy barrel. She remembered Gideon's instructions. Breathe out, squeeze, don't pull. She lined the iron sights perfectly on the chest of the tiger skin-clad outlaw leading the charge. She pulled the trigger. The boom of the Sharps was like a cannon in the confined space. The massive, 50 caliber slug tore through the blizzard, striking John King Fisher square in the shoulder, spinning the legendary gunslinger like a top and throwing him backward into the snow. The sheer concussive force of the buffalo rifle echoed off the surrounding peaks. Fisher, realizing instantly that this job was not worth losing an arm or his life, scrambled to his feet with a string of curses, abandoned his rifle, and limped frantically back toward the horses. Crenshaw stopped dead in his tracks, his hired protection fleeing. He looked at the cabin, his face pale with terror. Clara rapidly reloaded the Sharps, the heavy brass cartridge sliding into the breech with a satisfying clack. She fired again, blowing a massive hole in the snow mere inches from Crenshaw's boots. "Run, Wyatt!" Clara's voice boomed, amplified by the cabin walls, steady and fearless. "Or the next one takes your head." Wyatt Crenshaw broke. He dropped his gun and ran, stumbling blindly into the raging blizzard. chasing after men who would gladly leave him to freeze in the San Juans. Whether he survived the treacherous journey back to Oakhaven, Clara neither knew nor cared. She turned back to Gideon. He was pale, but he was grinning, wrapping a tourniquet tightly around his leg. "You shot John King Fisher," Gideon laughed weakly, shaking his head. "And you dragged me like I was a sack of feathers." Clara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his chest, tears of relief finally falling. "I told you I was heavy," she sobbed with a smile. "Turns out I have the strength to match it." Gideon pulled her down by her collar, pressing his lips to hers in a fiercely passionate kiss that tasted of gunpowder and salvation. "You're perfect," he whispered against her lips, "exactly as you are." Years later, travelers passing through the lower valleys would speak of the legendary family up at Whispering Pines. They spoke of a scarred mountain man and his beautiful, sturdy wife who ran the most prosperous trading post in the territory, building a life of unyielding love, anchored by the strength that others had once been foolish enough to mock. Did Clara's incredible courage and Gideon's unwavering loyalty make your heart race? True strength isn't about fitting in. It's about standing tall when it matters most. If you loved this thrilling tale of Wild West justice, romance, and frontier survival, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing, real-life inspired audio stories. Drop a comment below on what you thought of Clara's bravery. See you next time.